In 1960, the NFL came to Dallas, although this wasn't the first time. Despite their abysmal first season, where they didn't even have a single win, the team was able to stay afloat and eventually become the most valuable team in the entire NFL. So let's see how they made that happen. To understand how they made things work, we first have to understand why 1960 seemed to be the right place and right time for a Texas franchise, and why 1952, the year the original Dallas Texans were formed, was not. So, we'll take a slight detour to the Texans before getting back to the Cowboys. The year is 1951, and the NFL's New York Yanks are in a terrible position. Finishing off a season when they won just one game, their owner, Ted Collins, decided he wanted out. So Collins put the team up for sale. No one in or around New York City bid at the offer. Because New York is off the table due to a lack of interest, this opens it up to buyers in other cities. And onto the scene from Dallas comes Gordon McLendon, who wanted to move the team to his home state, only there was a problem. You see, McLendon was in radio, and one of the things he wanted to air were baseball games at his station. However, the major leagues didn't like him doing broadcasts in cities where they had minor league teams, and this led to a lawsuit. The NFL hears about this lawsuit and rejects his bid, so he goes to his friends Giles and Connell Miller. This evidently changed Burt Bell's mind, and so the sale was approved, and in a newspaper article detailing this sale, it goes over the backgrounds of the people involved. As an aside, the reporter calls Giles Miller's wife attractive. Not a big deal. However, in the same exact paragraph, he mentions Miller's sister-in-law by name, and he has absolutely nothing to say about her looks. It's like that clip from the Brady Bunch movie.
Marsha, you have grown up to be so gorgeous.
I know.
And Jan, isn't Marsha gorgeous?
Since people read newspapers back then way more than they do now, if the Millers saw that, I wonder what their reaction was. What's curious is they opted to keep the Yanks head coach Jimmy Fallon and Frank Fitzgerald, the Yanks general manager, which brings up to the question of how many times in professional sports has a team failed financially and yet they still keep the head coach and GM. So Texas finally had an NFL franchise, the Texas Rangers. Well, that's what they were supposed to be called before they suddenly changed it to the Dallas Texans. Anyway, in addition to fully embracing the Southern motif, supposedly while in transit to away games, they made the players wear these shirts. That's a thing that happened. You're traveling to an away game, you have to be dressed like that. The FlashbackDallas.com website cites a Dallas Morning News article from January 31st of 1952 that states the Texans would also be planning on having the players wear cowboy boots and 10-gallon hats. Whether they actually went ahead and did this is unclear, but that's the type of mentality the team management had.
Right.
If that wasn't bad enough, the Texans training camp in Kerrville, Texas had a big rattlesnake problem. So whenever a loose ball would roll into the weeds, the trainer would retrieve the ball. The logic being is that since he had a wooden leg, the chances of him getting bit was 50% less. And before you think I'm exaggerating about this, here's a photo from Kerrville from about 1910. Also, north of the city is a place called Rattlesnake Creek. Their very first game was at the Cotton Bowl against the Giants, and their very first score was the result of Tom Landry fumbling a punt. The Texans recovered and went on to score a touchdown. That would be the only scoring for the Texans that day, though, as the Giants blew them out 24-6. On a positive note, the Texans had halfback George Taliaferro and Buddy Young, who were the first professional black athletes in the state of Texas, and this helped draw attention from African-American fans. However, the seating in the Cotton Bowl was segregated, so it's unclear what specific types of sitting options they were given. After the home opener loss, the Texans would lose again, and then again, and then again, and then again. Oh, and then Texans head coach Jimmy Fallon kidnapped someone. They're going out to play the Rams, and their equipment manager says his wife needs him to stay home. Coach Fallon says, "Okay, but can you get on the plane and make sure everything's there?" So he gets on the plane, and then the coach tells the pilot to immediately take off. So they kidnap their own equipment manager. The Texans finally got their first and only win against the Chicago Bears at the Rubber Bowl in Akron, Ohio. By then, the financial situation with the Texans was so bad that they were no longer playing in Dallas and instead became a road team. That being said, they actually somehow managed to beat the Bears, and Chicago's coach was so mad that he was seen kicking at least one of his players in the butt after the loss when he saw him laughing and speaking with the Texans. To make things even more pathetic, before this game, there was a high school match that took place, and most of the fans left. Yeah, the 1952 Dallas Texans were upstaged by a high school football team. Let me repeat. They got showed up by a high school team, not a college team, which would have been bad enough. And to demonstrate just how few people must have still been there at the end of the game, Coach Phelan told the players to go up into the stands and shake the hands of the people there. So at least some of the players did that, and think about how awkward that would be for them. There's so few people there that saying shake their hands doesn't sound completely unrealistic. So the Texans, deeply in debt, went under, and the remnants of that franchise went to Baltimore to become the Colts, although the Colts don't officially count the Texans as being part of their history. And I don't blame them. Now, there are a number of factors that led to the 52 Dallas Texans failing, while the Cowboys, despite a similar dismal record, succeeded. In 1952, only about 34.2% of Americans had television sets. Compare this to 1960, where it was 87.1%. Could the Texans franchise have survived if they televised their games and television ownership was at 1960 levels? Maybe. If the 1951 season had NFL games on TV on a regular basis, this could have spiked interest in the Texans' 52 season. Or maybe the franchise still fails. There's no guarantee, but even if the Texans were doomed anyway, it's clear the Cowboys came about at the right place and the right time. So, if you were a television viewer in 1952, if your house even had a television, what were your options? Well, you had the DeMont Television Network. But if the 506 Archive website is correct, 2 Texans games actually were televised, but that left 10 games no one in Texas could see in full unless they were physically there. Aside from that, you had very brief moments from NFL highlight footage that DeMont did show in 2 different programs. However, it's important to note that these were highlights for NFL games in general and not for one particular game. These programs were Pro Football Highlights and Football Sidelines. Pro Football Highlights was only 30 minutes long, and again, it covered the entire NFL, and of course, it wasn't live footage, and Football Sidelines was even worse as it was only 15 minutes long. So, how does the attendance compare to the Dallas Cowboys in 1960, who also used the Cotton Bowl? Let's see. So for the first home game, the Cowboys had 30,000 fans compared to the Texans' first home game, which had 17,499. Then you have it dipping down to 18,500 for the Cowboys. It goes up again to 28,500, and then 25,500. 25,000 fans were what the 1952 Texans needed just to break even, according to the nephew of Giles Miller. Here we see the 1960 Cowboys meet this mark 3 out of their first 4 home games, while the 1952 Texans never met this mark even once. Only once all season did the 1952 Texans come close to the Cowboys' attendance in any of these games, and they only played 4 games in the Cotton Bowl in 52. And that was the Texans' first home game, where they were around 1,000 shy of the attendance of the Cowboys' second home game. And the Cowboys' last home game, attendance dropped to 10,000. So the 52 Texans beat the Cowboys' attendance for this in 3 out of their 4 home games. So while the Cowboys in 1960 were more popular than the Texans, at their lowest point, their home attendance was about equal to the Texans. Ultimately, it appears the Texans hypothetically could have continued if the ownership had deeper pockets like Murchison. This was, in theory, not a situation that was unrecoverable. Be that as it may, not everything was equal, and the Cowboys, by the virtue of the continued proliferation of television, had an advantage that 1952 Texans simply didn't have. Now, on to the Cowboys. Born on September 12, 1923, Clint Murchison Jr., the original owner and founder of the Cowboys, was born into wealth, as his father, Murchison Sr., had made it rich in the oil industry, but Murchison Jr. wasn't intent of just laying back and enjoying what his father did. He wanted to go out and do stuff on his own. This includes real estate, construction, restaurants, and he would go on to even fund a pirate radio station, but he's most known for football, and this takes us to the 50s, where supposedly before forming the Cowboys, he originally tried to buy the 49ers and then the Washington Redskins. However, I wasn't able to find any contemporary newspaper accounts confirming this. The reason why I'm inclined to believe in the Redskins story the most, and both stories are probably true, is the animosity Redskins owner George Preston Marshall had for the concept of a Dallas Cowboys team. People who write stories about the Redskins not wanting a team in Texas, but only because they didn't want competition in the South, don't seem to be telling the whole story. Think of just how far away Dallas is from Washington, D.C. I haven't heard anything about Marshall trying to stop the Chicago Cardinals from moving to St. Louis, which was even closer to him. The Southern thing might have been part of the equation, but the main underlying reason would appear to be a business deal gone bad. Supposedly in 1958, the deal was almost done to move the Redskins to Texas, but then Marshall wanted to change some of the terms, and this made Murchison mad, so they stopped talking. That, to me, better explains the tension between the two much better than, you can't have the team in the South with me, even though you're 1,335 miles away. Researchers who use that excuse never seem to mention that Marshall didn't make a big fuss about the Dallas Texans in 1952. Maybe he didn't like that either, but the real story seems to be tied to the broken business deal. Now, for NFL expansion, you needed every team to approve the move, and with Marshall out, it looked like it might not go through, but that's where Lamar Hunt comes in. Hunt was another rich son of a man who made his money in oil, and he too wanted a football team in Texas. So, since the Cardinals wanted to leave Chicago, he tried to reach a way to get them to Dallas. However, that fell through. He then joined with some investors and tried to create a brand new Texas team, but the NFL said no, and not surprisingly because of how bad that original 1952 team was. So, instead of giving up, Lamar Hunt decided to form his own football league, the AFL. Once the NFL heard about this and realized Texas, one of the more populous states, could be lost to the NFL, they changed their minds about the concept of another team in Dallas, and this gave Murchison an inroad to try to form his own team. He just needed to get past Marshall. So the popular story goes that the Redskins owner and Barney Breeskin, the composer who wrote the team song Hail to the Redskins, had a bit of a falling out. You see, Marshall had never actually bought the legal rights to the song. This was retained by Breeskin, so he reached out to Murchison's attorneys with the offer of selling the rights to Murchison in an effort to spite Marshall. A deal was made, and Breeskin was given $2,500 for selling it, and now all of a sudden, Marshall could no longer legally play his favorite fight song at his own games. Marshall gave in to get the song back, and the votes were cast, and the Dallas Stars officially became a part of the NFL. Probably after realizing they were naming themselves after a bull that had been castrated, they changed it to the Rangers, and finally, on March 16, 1960, they settled on the Dallas Cowboys. And by the way, I'm not joking about the Steers thing. I could be wrong, but it seems the Cowboys management picked the name because that's a common word associated with Texas ranches, but they weren't actually really thinking about the definition and implications of the name. They just liked how it sounded phonetically. So they switched their name to the Rangers, but backed away from that to avoid confusion with the Rangers minor league baseball team. As an aside, the Major League Texas Rangers wouldn't come to be until 1972. Getting back to Breeskin and Marshall, I wasn't able to find any contemporary accounts to back up that story either, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. During this time period, coverage of sports was really abbreviated. They tell you a bit about what happened in the game, but when it came time for the behind-the-scenes matters, you definitely could find some stuff, but it didn't go into the level of detail that people do today. Now, even though the Cowboys franchise wasn't officially approved until January 28, 1960, Murchison had to be feeling confident because he and his business partner, Bedford Wen, signed Tom Landry on December 27, 1959 to a personal services contract. Because this is a deep dive, I'm going to now turn the attention to Coach Landry and move the clock back so you can understand not only how much he meant for the Cowboys, but just what type of amazing life story he had. Tom Landry was born on September 11, 1924, in Mission, Texas. a small town where he would spend the first 17 years of his life. His family, however, ended up in Texas by happenstance. Originally, Landry's great-grandfather was in Canada, the son of French immigrants, and Landry, by the way, was originally spelled with the French phonetics of ending in an IE instead of a Y. His own grandfather ended up in Illinois, and it was there that Tom Landry's father, Ray, was born. However, Ray suffered from muscular rheumatism, and a doctor recommended they move to a warmer climate, so they went to Texas. And this represents the butterfly effect of history. If his father, Ray, never had that condition, they never go to Texas, and Ray never meets his future wife, Ruth, and Tom Landry is never born. His father dated Ruth in high school. However, her family moved to Los Angeles after she graduated, and things could have ended it there. But his father dropped out of college, moved to California, got a job, and took training as a mechanic to be with her. They got married and moved back to Texas, but it easily could have gone very differently. Now, for Landry, life in Mission, Texas removed the possibility of any real consistent privacy, as the town was so small, everyone knew everyone else, and subsequently, everyone knew everyone else's business. For example, when Tom Landry was about 5 or 6, he had a bicycle accident where he fell off and landed on a cactus, butt first. So his mother, with the help of some neighbors, took tweezers and removed the cactus needles from his backside. Yeah, neighbors not only heard about this, that would be bad enough, but they were physically there to help remove the needles, and with a town of that size, there's no way that stayed a secret outside that small group. And in terms of Landry being quiet and stoic, he said part of this at least was due to a speech impediment he had when he was younger that made him self-conscious about talking. And he also said perhaps he inherited some of that low-key personality from his mother. Another incident occurred, which was much more serious than the cactus one. He was on his porch, waiting for his father and uncle to return from a deer hunting trip. As their Model T showed up, Landry raced out to greet them without looking in the other direction, where he was struck by an oncoming car. He was treated at a doctor's office without the aid of anesthesia, where his father had to leave the room because he hated seeing his son in that much pain. However, Landry cried out for his father, and he came back and stayed with them for the remainder of the time. Luckily, the injury wasn't too severe, but this brings up another historical question of what if? Landry's father was a mechanic and also acted as the chief of the volunteer fire department, a point Landry was proud of, and he would often get on his bike and follow his father's vehicle as he responded to emergencies. Tom Landry would play football and basketball with his friends, and he occasionally would listen to a Yankees game on the radio, but when he was younger, he didn't actually know that much about professional sports. As a matter of fact, he didn't even know there was a professional football league, and that demonstrates just how different things were back then. Before the age of television, and with radio, books, and movies being the only window to the rest of the country, it was possible for a kid to like football, play football with his friends, but not know the NFL existed. That speaks to the relative isolation of a small town in the 1930s, but also to the NFL's lack of popularity at the time. As a side note, when he would fantasize about life outside his small town, one of the things he envisioned himself being was a cowboy. So becoming a cowboy in the NFL, albeit in an abstract sense, was kind of interesting. By high school, however, he was finally able to play organized football, where he played center despite his smaller size. However, he would later be moved to quarterback in part because his coach, Bob Martin, who lived 2 doors down, had seen Landry throwing a ball through a hanging tire. Aside from football, Landry tried to be in band, but he couldn't play any instruments, so they made him a drummer, but that didn't work out either because he didn't have any rhythm. For 1 year, he was in a choir, but he was so bad when it came time to sing in competitions, he would simply mouth the words. And one time he did sing, but he sounded so awful the guy in front of him turned around and gave him a look that made him be quiet. So was Tom Landry as bad of a singer as he made himself out to be? Check out this commercial he did in 1990.
Mamas, don't let your babies grow up to be redskins.
And as a bonus, we have the outtakes.
Going with you, Tom Landry, you're on.
Oh, sorry.
I like his strategy of singing by simply talking and stretching out the syllables. I'm the same way. And one of his more embarrassing moments came when he won the lead in a school play. You see, it wasn't until after he got the part that he read the play all the way through and realized he would have to kiss his co-star. While this wasn't his first kiss, it would be the first time doing it in public with his family and friends all watching, and they didn't help things when, during the kiss, people started whistling and cheering. He wrote that if he could have died of embarrassment, he would have right there. And as far as academics went, he did well making the National Honor Society, although he didn't have as much of a natural aptitude for English and literature. As for him, math and science seemed easier. His high school didn't have a baseball team, interestingly enough, so he played the sport a few summers for a local semi-pro team. Although his school did have a basketball team, which he played for, their basketball court was outdoors as they didn't have a proper gym. Back to football. In Landry's senior year in 1941, the Mission Eagles got off to a great start, improving in last year. Landry led the way at quarterback, quarterback/tailback, as he put it. After getting off to a 4-0 start, Landry was receiving a lot of attention in the media, but he tried not to let it get to his head. One newspaper inaccurately reported him as being 170 pounds, when in reality he was 13 pounds lighter, although in 1941, it may have been a bit harder to fact-check a detail like that at the high school level. There was one play in their game against Donna, a local high school, that was marked by controversy. It was a penalty an official called, and it was so bad, not only would it never been called today, but it's confusing as to how an official could even make that mistake. So Landry was on defense, defending a pass play from Donna's quarterback. The official ruled it was interference in the end zone, and that part wasn't controversial, but what the official said next was just bizarre. Because Landry had committed interference around the end zone, the official automatically gave the other team a touchdown. Landry's coach ran out onto the field and said, "You can't give a team a touchdown for that penalty. You have to move the ball to the 1-yard line." The official ignored Coach Martin, and the touchdown stood. The officials would later convene after the game and admit that he was right. What I'm guessing happened here is the official was using the logic that if a team is called for holding while in their own end zone, with the ball carrier being behind the line of scrimmage, it's a safety and the other team gets 2 points. So he saw that rule and thought, pass interference in the end zone, that's got to be a touchdown. Regardless, it turned out to be water under the bridge as they still won that game and continued their undefeated streak. 2 games later, and still unbeaten, Landry suffered an injury below his right eye. He initially stayed in, but eventually had to leave the field as his face had become incredibly swollen. It turned out he broke his cheekbone. You have to remember back then players simply wore leather helmets with no face masks. So his coach modified his helmet to padding over his face. Prior to the face mask becoming mandatory, I have heard of teams being allowed to modify a helmet to help protect a player from injury, but I'm not sure when this practice started. But it's interesting to see it happening as early as 1941, as I had previously associated this with Paul Brown and his team in the 50s. So Landry's team wins out, and now they're about to play the bi-district championship in Aransas Pass against the Aransas Pass Panthers. And they're traveling there not by bus, but by train. They shut out their opponent 19-0, and this brought them to their final game against Hondo for the regional championship in South Texas. The spirit of things would get interrupted as 2 days after their match against Aransas, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Landry writes that it took a little bit of time for the full impact of this to settle in. His older brother Robert would soon enlist in response to this, going into the Army Air Corps. Despite things getting serious, over 3,000 Mission Eagles fans packed the stadium to see Landry's team beat Hondo 33-0 and stand on top of the football world of South Texas. Landry wrote that even before the season was over, he was already getting overtures from people wanting him to consider different colleges. Doc Newhouse, an oil man who lived in Mission, reached out to Landry trying to get him to go to his alma mater, the University of Texas, under head coach D.X. Bible. Another time, a friend drove him to Rice University to meet their coach, and at that time Rice Field was the biggest stadium Landry had ever been in. He remarked the entire population of his small town could fit in the end zone seats. A friend of his older brother encouraged him to try out Mississippi State. Landry had doubts that they really knew anything about him and suspected they were just agreeing to a meeting because his brother's friend had gone to school there, but he decided to travel there anyway. Jimmy Mays, one of Landry's teammates, agreed to travel with him to Mississippi to check the school out, And even though Landry didn't say it, this might have been the first time in his life he had traveled to another state. The bus ride was long though, and the ride back took over 24 hours, and he concluded that that was just too far from home, so if he was going to play college ball, it needed to be in Texas. Doc Newhouse continued to try to court Landry. This time, he got the University of Texas to send Bully Gilstrap, an assistant coach to UT, to have dinner with Landry. After Landry was done eating a big steak, Gilstrap mentioned the prestige of the University of Texas and how just about anyone in the state that was famous went there. He even mentioned that it was closer to home and his family would easily be able to make the trip there, although truth be told, the actual drive time by car from Mission to Austin is about 5 hours, so maybe not quite as easy as Gilstrap made it seem. Still though, not as far away as it could have been, relatively speaking. He would know some people at the school, as one friend who skipped a grade and graduated earlier would be going there. So he talked it over with Coach Martin and his family, and he agreed to accept a full scholarship to UT. And the summer before class began, Doc Newhouse got him a job working in the oil fields. This was exhausting labor. However, it paid over $4 an hour. He didn't say how much over $4 it was, but using an inflation calculator, if you put it in at exactly $4 in the summer of 1942, that translates to $73.13 an hour in $2022. That summer job was going to ensure he had plenty of money to last for his college freshman year. His career, though, doing the dirty work in the oil fields, came to an end when he slipped off a muddy step and fell 10 feet down a hole and landed in a pipe where the metal spigot stuck into his shin. Thankfully, this injury didn't cause too much long-term damage, so his playing career wasn't derailed. As a freshman at UT, he started off as a third-string player, in part due to how much talent they had. However, he would bulk up even more, bringing his weight up to 190. And of course, as a freshman, there was hazing, and he was made to sing his school song, and once they heard his voice, they never asked him to sing again. Getting back to the oil industry, he decided to study engineering, as even though he was no longer going to be doing the grunt work, he saw potential in the field. All the concerns about football and progress in the depth chart, however, went away when he received a phone call from his family that his brother Robert was missing in action. While flying over the North Atlantic, his plane disappeared near Iceland. No one wanted to believe he was really dead, and they held out hope that a miracle would happen, but none would come. Official news of his death came a few weeks later. Landry tried to bury himself in football in school, but nothing worked. He noted that his family was overt when it came to affection. However, he never had any doubt his family loved him. But due to this mentality, Landry never got a chance to tell his brother in words how much he really meant to him. So in November of 1942, Landry followed his brother's footsteps and enlisted to become a pilot. He was a reservist, so he stayed in school until February of 1943, where he had basic training at Shepherd's Field and then pre-flight training at Kelly Field near San Antonio. He got assigned to a college training detachment at Eastern Oklahoma State College, and it's here that he actually gets in an airplane for the first time in his life. That's right, Landry had never been in a plane, even as a passenger. Well, on the first flight with his instructor, about 200 feet in the air, the engine died, essentially converting it into a hang glider, but the instructor kept his cool and was able to land. This incident, however, seemed to help him ironically, as every other training flight after that was a breeze in comparison. He got the worst possible scenario, where you don't die that is, and he got it out of the way at the very beginning. So in the fall of 1944, his combat orders finally come in, and he's sent to England aboard the Queen Mary. As an interesting side note, Mickey Rooney performed a comedy/music show on the ship while Landry was on his way across the Atlantic. That must have been a little weird and surreal to see, and of course his thoughts of him being in the very same waters where his brother died must have been hard to leave his head. So the ship lands in Liverpool, and they take a train to the 8th Air Force 493rd Squadron in Ipswich, about an hour and 41 minutes northeast of London. By this point in the war, most of Germany's Air Force was destroyed, but they still had to worry about their guns on the ground. Landry's first combat mission was to bomb and destroy the Mersburg oil fields. Flying into a black cloud, obscuring visibility, the engine of the B-17 was so loud it drowned out the explosions down below, but he could sometimes still feel the vibrations making it all the way up to the plane. And, after a mission, getting back was another difficult matter. You had limited fuel, and fog would often obscure where you were, and since there were hundreds of planes also returning, the threat of a mid-air collision was always there. So it limited what you could do if you had difficulty finding your bearings, and if that wasn't enough, their airfields were camouflaged to deter German bombers, and there were no radar in the planes, so there was a danger you could survive the first part of the mission, be successful, only to be killed over England on your way home. On one mission, the bomber was running out of fuel, and all 4 engines suddenly died, leaving Landry and the men with him the prospect of having to parachute out, only they were over the Netherlands, which is occupied enemy territory. Even if it was in friendly territory, though, there was no guarantee everything was going to be okay. There was a pilot in the Ipswich crew that had bailed out under those circumstances, and of his 10-man crew, only his parachute opened. Everyone else fell to their deaths. So they were about to jump out, but something stopped Landry. He turned around and turned the fuel mixture knob all the way forward, and the engines came back to life. Flying low and now dodging German gunfire, they managed to fly it back home. On another mission, after returning from Czechoslovakia, they were over France and had to dip below the fog to find an emergency place to land, but all they saw were trees. Suddenly, they saw a clearing, and that's when they lowered the plane for the landing. The plane ended up sliding into 2 trees that broke both wings off before coming to rest against another tree. But not only did every man on board survive, there weren't even any injuries. All told, Landry flew 30 combat missions, and he was instilled with a confidence he never had before. Anything in life after this, even the hard stuff, was going to seem easy in comparison. It's one thing to be in the military, and another thing to be in the military and have combat experience, and this is a common thing I've heard about soldiers returning from war. Football practice was suddenly nothing. Complaining about practicing on a hot day when you just want to go inside, being cranky because you have to wake up early when you didn't get enough sleep, even being involved in a series of violent skirmishes in the football field against a tough opponent. Nothing, absolutely nothing just mentioned here remotely compares. People like to complain about how the younger generations of athletes aren't as tough as they used to be, and sometimes these comparisons can be exaggerated, but there's something to be said about the athletes that had to go through combat during World War II and managed to make it back. Landry got to see the world. He went to multiple locations in the US, crossed the Atlantic, walked through war-torn London, and flew all over Europe, and he did all of this in the space of just 3 years. Not bad for a kid from a small Texas town in the middle of nowhere. That's the end of part 1. When we continue, we'll finish up Landry's college football career, his time with Vince Lombardi and the Giants, and finally his first year as head coach of what would become one of the most loved and hated franchises in sports history. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. See you next time.